Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to Hybrid Pulse check number 2. We'll let folks come in. Got tons of people registered for this one, so excited to get going with Kevin and Nick. They've both got nice shirts on today. Maybe I should have worn a shirt. I've gone for the branded look, but maybe I should have worn a shirt. Anyway, we were just talking about football teams, right, Nick? We were Arsenal, Tottenham, your woe.
That doesn't end well for me, given that one I support is not doing very well. So I think we should move on.
So whilst we wait for others to join, I heard that the new kind of "where are you calling from today?" You know, the start of every Zoom call. Hey, where do I find you today? I heard the new one is, who do you bank with? Given all that's been going on, well, maybe that's just my my startup world here. But come on, Nick, who do you bank with? Doesn't have to be personal, but corporately.
Thankfully, Stanford Federal Credit Union. We have a university bank. It's a bit odd, but and I don't think they did anything exotic in their assets. So thankfully, I don't think they put it into T-bills. They probably, I was joking with a friend I saw on the weekend that I wouldn't be surprised if, that there's just a large room full of cash and that's where it is, it's something like that. At least you can't lose it. I mean, it's still there, the paper money. I was amazed to see, by the way, in the statistic that Mercury Bank is the second biggest beneficiary of Silicon Valley Bank customers.
Yeah, massively.
It's a new entire online bank, which is kind of an interesting thing. I don't think they have any physical branches.
Bunch of founder friends started doing it on Wednesday evening. This is before the Thursday news break. So yeah. Kevin, a personal question, I know. Bank of choice?
Yeah, so for charter, for our company, we've banked with Mercury. We also, our primary bank is Morgan Stanley. Yeah.
Nice and safe. There
was some calm during the SVB meltdown to be at Morgan Stanley.
And I raise a point on Hybrid Pulse. I made a claim, and I think we were going to debate this, but one of the irritants of the SVB meltdown was the fact they're operating fully remotely for about 18 months.
What did you think of that? I mean, I saw that. I was like, come on, surely, these are very sensible people. But I do, what was the critique, Nick, that people wouldn't have?
Well, okay, so
we each other in the corridors?
Okay, so I have no inside information on SVB. And also, as you know, I'm a big fan of remote work. I've been working this for 20 years, but there are some downsides to remote work, particularly fully remote, put it this way, what SVB did was, many people claimed it was pretty incompetent. They're a loved bank and they did some fantastic things. And a lot of people are still fond of them, but their risk management was a disaster. And strikes me, some people in that organization must have known that. They must have thought, well, look, we really shouldn't be taking all these cash deposits and putting them into long dated treasuries, because if the interest rate goes up, suddenly we're going to be wiped out. Now, I would have thought it's easier maybe to debate that if you're in Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday, because imagine I'm worried about it in these big, Zoom meetings of 20 people. I may not want to raise it, but if in person, I may see Kevin and say, hey, Kevin, as I walk out of a meeting, there's something on my mind. I want to run it by you and kind of build a coalition. I don't know. I've heard from a lot of managers, it is hard to have really controversial, challenging discussions. Sometimes online is easier in person. And it may be that someone was worried. So I'll stop there, but that's my...
Yeah. I would, Nick, I think people have, basically the thing that happened with SVB is they were mismanaged. They had no risk officer for 9 months, during which time they reduced their hedged position from 50% to 0% of their assets under management. And I'm not convinced that if they had been fully in person, it's just like such a structural.
No, not fully in person. So to be very clear,
or even if they had been in hybrid, that would have, like, so many people must have known. They had lots of opportunities to raise alarms about this, and it just seems like culturally or structurally there was no pushback or urgency around it.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, big fans of SVB at Cadence. We also do a lot of bank with HSBC. And now we do a lot of banking with lots of people over the last few weeks as well. So we've got lots of accounts set up now. But good to start off there on something topical. We've got folks still trickling in. Please add your chats, questions throughout this time. We will talk for 45 minutes. We will share the recording afterwards, and do submit any questions through the Q&A tab. We have the wonderful Natalie as well, who's on hand answering any questions. But yeah, great to be joined today. Nick, very quickly, who are you? What are you doing here? Same for Kevin, and then we'll dive right in. And I've said to the guys, right, we're going to get some, I'm bored of webinars. Everybody passionately agrees with each other. So we're going to have some really good banter today. Nick, we'll start with you.
You can hear I'm British, but I live in California. And I'm work at Stanford. I'm a professor here. And I guess my claim to fame is, weirdly enough, I've been working on working from home as a research topic for 20 years. I'm a big supporter of it. And no one was that interested until March 2020. And then suddenly, it really took off as a topic. And I spend my time probably pretty much every day, all the time, talking to firms and managers, and also just collecting a lot of data.
Do you have like the like presidents have like the pre-election and post-election like photos where they've added loads of gray hair and they've aged? Have you got like the pre-Nick photo before the pandemic?
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, as we were saying, I'm going to be 50 next month. So there's no problems with finding gray hairs. I'm doing my best to cut my hair shorter and shorter, but yes, it's there. The one interesting thing, by the way, is hybrid. The whole theme of today is about, and for Kane is a hybrid. Hybrid was not a thing pre-2020. The word didn't even exist. When I talked to firms about working from home in 2019, 2010, 2005, it was basically a play on, let's have some team or folks go fully remote and save on the office space. It was an all office space thing. And occasionally it was about recruiting folks that wouldn't come to the office. But it was either all or nothing. And what's amazing is hybrid has become so dominant now, which, in many ways, by the way, it isn't that weird, because even pre-pandemic, we work at home in the evenings and the weekends. So you could see it's more of an evolution of what we were doing earlier.
Well, we definitely struggled to know what to call it for the first little while, right? It was flex, it was all sorts before. Cool, Kevin, I'm really delighted to have you join today. You put up such great content and newsletters, so really excited to have you. What's Charter up to?
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, so Charter's a media and research insights company that's focused on future of work issues, transforming workplaces to be more fair and dynamic. We have a newsletter that goes out to about 100,000 people now, and then we work with companies on their issues that they're wrestling with, including hybrid work. So like Nick, we're talking to lots of companies that are wrestling with these issues and have really admired and the work that Nick has done, and really drawn a lot of insights from it over the last few years.
Yeah, I've got two of my top three on today. You guys really follow closely, and then Draw Proleg, I really follow quite closely as well. He's really high quality. So we've got a good one today. Maybe we'll get Draw on next time. So great, we're going to dive right in. We've got some juicy topics coming up. What's new? 4-day work week. UK in particular, this has been a really big thing. Both Nick and I based in California, but might be able to comment a little bit on the UK, what's happening there. Apple in the news again over the last 96 hours or so, tracking attendance, office mandates, what's going to bring people back, forced remote versus optional versus coordinated. Is it all really working? Let's start with I'm pretty passionate about the 4-day work week in the way in which people probably don't expect me to be passionate about. Let's start with that. Kevin, any of your clients and any of your network, have they been experimenting with 4-day work weeks on the East Coast?
Yeah, not a lot of the people we're working with today, but I wrote a piece for the New York Times about a year or so ago, looking at the companies that were experimenting with the 4-day work week. The people who I talked to generally were very positive about it. They felt that the engagement of their employees went up. They were able to actually do a similar amount of work. They said that it required a lot more discipline around meetings in particular, that you couldn't actually have sprawling internal meetings, that they tried to limit meetings after certain times of day to be able to get their work done during the 4-day week. at our own company at Charter, we don't have a week, but we do, we have a practice that I think works really well, which is that on Fridays, we don't have any internal meetings scheduled. And quarterly, at least, we have a mental health day on Fridays. So we've not gone full 4-day, but definitely see some benefits.
So is it you guys contributing to Nick's golf course bookings going up post on Fridays? Is that you guys? Cool. That's super helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been some interesting data. I mean, trivial to some extent, apart from the golf course owners. That Nick, you posted recently about golf course attendance being up considerably post or now that we're in more of a hybrid mentality. What are you mean you speak with everybody? Does anybody, Nick? What's going on the street? RE 4-day work weeks?
So I distinguish between two really different things. So one is 4 days of work for 4 days of pay, and that's part-time, and that's great. We've had part-time probably 100 years. I suspect if you go back to Victorian Britain, there were people working part-time, but I have nothing wrong with part-time. And maybe people want to work 6 for 6 days of pay. The other thing is 4 days of work for 5 days of pay. That is very problematic. I must have spoken to about 100 managers, and they're universally against it and upset. Some of them are really angry. They said, like, you're telling me that I'm so bad at my job, I'm such a bad manager, that I could easily get rid of a day and people would be as productive. And one of them said to me, imagine you're on holiday and your holiday company says, we've discovered that you're not enjoying yourself enough. You sometimes are waiting for meals, or you're arguing with your spouse, or you look a bit miserable. So we've decided we're going to cut one of your days of holiday, but you have to make yourself 20% happier on the other days. It's like, you can't control that. So the research on it is, just so everyone is aware, it's not really research. It's surveys of a bunch of volunteer small companies that have signed up. There is a lot of economics research going back decades. And what it shows is up to about 60 hours a week, people's output is linear with hour, and then you start to get tired. So if you take people from 40 to 32 hours, they'll do, 20% less. And that's fine if you pay them 20% less, that's no problems. I'm aware in California that they're proposing to have a 32-hour week, but pay people for 40 hours. I think if that happens, that's an amazing job generation scheme for Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona, our neighboring states, as everyone flees out. Or when I talk to companies, they say, what we're going to do is we're going to fire everyone and then rehire them, so we can basically reset them on a lower wage. But again, part-time, fantastic. I'm all in favor of that. Basically paying people for 4 days, 5 days, but they work 4, unless you're in a very uncompetitive sector. Yeah.
That 60 hours is fascinating. Does that include commute times in that 60 hours of productivity before tail off? Is that part of that?
No. So I'll tell you what it is. It's a lot of things where you can measure output per hour. So, maybe it doesn't translate, but it's like manufacturing, piecework, telephone centers, IT support, things where you can see what people are doing minute by minute. And it looks like output per hour is relative versus 60 hours is getting on for quite long days. So when I was at McKinsey, I worked 100-hour weeks. For sure, once you go beyond 60, you're getting kind of tired, and each extra hour is less and less. And at some point, probably you hit net zero. I don't know, 80, 90, but.
Kevin, isn't this, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
No, 30 or 32. I can see, look, if you're a manager, if you're going above 60, there's some clear trade-offs. But from 32 to 40, people are producing roughly the same per hour as they were. And so if you cut their hours by 20%, you're basically cutting output by 20%. Most businesses can't really afford, they're not so profitable, they can easily lose 20% of sales.
Kevin, is this about hours or is this about outcomes in your mind?
I think the shift in work needs to be, and I think Nick has talked about this too, is a shift from measuring hours to measuring outcomes. And that's, a shift that a lot of managers need to make, particularly around more flexible work arrangements, where they're used to just looking over and seeing someone sitting in their chair from 9 to 5, they're doing the hours, and that is reassuring that they're working. Whereas when you're in less traditional, more flexible arrangements, you do have to count hours. The thing that, I'm sort of thinking, I have two reactions to what Nick said. One is, I think you're making the point that the research on the 4-day work week is actually not rigorous or extensive enough to really extrapolate, as a lot of the media coverage has around the experiments in the UK and elsewhere. And I think that's a really important point that, you know, we should all be watching. The first point you made, though, I'm sort of raised as a question for me, which is managers are mad that they couldn't do their job 20% more efficiently. And I think putting aside the, like, you know, working on a manufacturing line where output is directly related to the amount of time that you're on the line. So let's just talk about knowledge workers specifically. I do think about all the surveys about how people have so much unproductive time in their weeks, the amount of meetings they're in that they shouldn't be in, the number of email exchanges that they're dealing with that they shouldn't have. Like, if you had a culture of greater discipline around how people actually spend their time in knowledge jobs, what is the percentage of greater efficiency that you could achieve? And if you gave that back to people in the form of a half day or an additional day off, like, would it offset, would it allow you to do the same amount of work and just have better quality of life, better engagement, better quality of work when they're doing it? So I don't know, that I see your points, Nick, but I do think you're underestimating the amount of work that people do that is not productive.
No,
Yeah.
so I totally on board. So to put a positive thing on it, so I totally agree with that. In fact, I got into working from home because even further before then, I was doing stuff on management. So I had this thing called the World Management Survey, and you're right, there's tremendous variation. I had a call this morning of the census, the US Census Bureau. We have data on 40,000 firms across the US. So there's amazing variation. I'm totally on board. And there are some firms that are wasting vast amounts of time. But completely aligned with you, what we should be doing is managing an output. So if you said to me, Nick, it turns out you're grossly inefficient, if I'm just going to give you your targets and your sales figures, or, you know, your reports, and you figure out how you do them, I think that's a great way to manage, is that output management. I think the real problem is focusing on hours and telling managers that, you know, for those that are well managed already, put it this way, it's pretty rude.
Yeah.
I get that there are some, if you're a terrible manager in some sleepy industry, then maybe. And the other thing to point out is, I didn't realize, but in California, it's hard to do 5 days of work in 4 days. So another thing I think is a great idea is telling people that are paid per hour, you know, you could work for 10 hours a day for 4 days rather than 8 for 5 and not commute. Or in fact, one hospital I spoke to said they were doing 3 shifts of 13 hours a day, and then let employees choose. And most people said, you know, particularly lower income folks, turns out have pretty long commutes because they can't afford to live near the office. And so for some of them, that's hugely appealing. And so again, that's the same thing as we want you to achieve your output, but you have more flexibility around it. So I'm totally on board with good management. This just seems a completely reverse way around. It's like a really weird, I mean, why not pick 3 days of work or 2 days, you know, just.
Yeah.
And
well, the arrangements you're talking about work, my mother was a nurse growing up, and she worked in a hospital, and she worked extra long shifts 3 days a week, which gave her the flexibility when I was a kid to be around. And that was great. That was a big difference maker.
How much of all this is the narrative that managers want people to be working longer, getting more output, which is, you know, obviously what they're there for. And ultimately, you know, people producing keeps people in jobs, gets 401ks and pensions paid, and, you know, you're able to keep up or outcompete your competitors. But also, you know, we're surrounded by at Cadence such an amazing group of people that, you know, want to do the best work of their careers here too. And so, you know, there's a sense of, you know, why should high performers and people that really, why should they be limited? So if you've got somebody that actually wants to be putting in more hours than the government now is telling them they can't do, you know, you can't tell Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo or Steph Curry, hey, you can't train 7 days a week, you have to train 4 days a week. Like, I think that's the other side of the narrative that I think is missing in the larger meta narrative here.
I think in any of those scenarios, people can work longer. I was in France, I was working in Paris as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal when they instituted the 35-hour work week. And there was a joke. People said, I love the 35-hour work week. I love it so much, I do it twice a week. And you know, there are definitely people in careers like consulting and finance and startups and other careers where people are working hours. You wind up getting more vacation as a journalist. We end up getting extra vacation, but the understanding is that we could work as much as we wanted whenever
Yeah.
there was news or whenever we needed to.
What
If-
about
if
those? Go, Nick.
I was going to say, if I was to sum up my thoughts on it, the whole buzz around the 4-day work week is honestly buzz. I mean, there's a lot of fluff, but there is a real thing here, as Kevin and you, Dan, highlighted, which is we should be rewarding for performance. So I don't really think we should be counting hours. I think we should be setting people performance targets. And if they're really efficient and get it done quickly, that's great. And particularly when you talk to managers for work from home workers, that becomes particularly important because you can't observe what folks are doing. So if Kevin's my manager, when I'm in the office, he can maybe see me typing, so he kind of has a rough idea of what my hours are. As soon as I work from home, he doesn't really have any idea. And it's horrible if he's using surveillance software, keystroke stuff. So in fact, for semi or fully remote workers, you even more so want to be evaluating on performance and output.
We'll talk about evaluating office space in a moment, and what we're seeing trend-wise on physical space. Just a question come in. But talking about tracking, Nick, on that topic, you know, buzz here in the Valley the last couple of days has been, you know, taking attendance at Apple, tracking key cards for coming into buildings. There's been, you know, cartoons of Tim Cook looking very menacing, etc., trying to track people. I moved from Cupertino last year, somewhere else in the Valley. Most of my friends, I've got 2 neighbors that work for Apple. They're actually frustrated when their colleagues don't go into the office. And for the most part, my friends at Apple are wanting to go in regularly. What are you seeing in the tracking side of this? Are they the only ones? Is this actually really happening, or is this just another rage against the boss topic?
So firstly, most firms have the ability to know. I've worked with a few and they basically say, look, we do see swipe cards. We do see people coming in and out. We're not sure what to do with it. Actually, they're struggling. So, you know, Kevin sees me coming in only on Wednesdays. What does he do? He may tell my line manager, whisper. I mean, I think in terms of practice, if you have a hybrid setup as Apple does, which everyone comes in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it's important that everyone comes in. Imagine you have 10 people in a team, 9 come in and 1 doesn't. You then have a team meeting and the one person that doesn't come in forces everyone else to get on Zoom, and it's really frustrating. So there's enormous spillover effects, and the other 9 feel like, why did I come in? You know, I spent 40 minutes coming in and now I'm sitting on Zoom because person X is at home.
Yeah.
So I actually think once you've set the policy, there's tremendous what we call spillovers. There's a public good thing here. You know, it's kind of like everyone may say, look, I don't need to obey parking rules. You know, it's not for me, but or I don't need to pay taxes. Other people, it's the same kind of thing. So I think once you've decided on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then it makes sense to have folks come in, whether you really need to take attendance. As you say, it's basically an employee's interest to come in actually on those days. If you look at the data, another thing you see is strong evidence of presenteeism bias. So that the 3 of us, and Dan, you decide to, you know, watch the World Cup, not come in for, you know, a month on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you basically going to end up suffering. I mean, Kevin and I do a bit because we have meetings, we have to Zoom you in, but the biggest loser in the end is the folks that don't come in because they don't get promoted.
There's a question. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Nick, one of the big challenges that I've talked to people about is during the pandemic, they hired a lot of people remotely. They thought we can tap into the bigger labor market. It actually has been helpful for diversity of their teams. In some cases, they can access talent that they weren't able to access before. And then now they're trying to have people come into offices in hybrid arrangements, but then the teams are kind of structurally, permanently, part of them remote. And that's a really tough situation people are struggling with, because to your point, you come into the office and then you get on a Zoom call because your colleagues aren't there. If that is permanently the case, it's really hard.
Yeah.
I totally agree. Actually, I get asked this all the time. Actually, I'd be interested what you're advising companies to do.
I mean, and I think you and I have talked about this before. I think what you have to do is actually one of the solutions that I think is most interesting is if your company is big enough, think about putting the remote folks together on the same team. So if you have a marketing team and you're able to do it, have a remote only marketing team and that everyone else is hybrid. And that way you could conceivably avoid some of the problems. The alternatives are to kind of downgrade the responsibilities of those people, phase them out over time. The alternatives are not great.
Is there, one of the questions we've had in has been around, given the topic of being face-to-face here, and for you, Nick, you mentioned presenteeism here, and one of the questions is about innovation. Is that taking a hit as a result of work from home? You've got some data around, I think it's trip.com, 15% rise in innovation if you're face-to-face, but a 35% drop in resignations if you offer remote as part of your hybrid cadence. Innovation suffering not being face-to-face?
Yeah, so actually I'm just like writing up, and I will put it out in about a month, a big review of the evidence. I tell you, the review of the evidence is becoming reasonably clear now 3 years in. So if you look at fully remote, so people that never come in are working from home 5 days a week, week in, week out, it looks like productivity is down 10 to 20%. Creativity is down. So the best paper in innovation is a paper in Nature, a very carefully done randomized control trial. You then may ask, why would anyone have fully remote? The reason, it saves a lot of money. So even if productivity is down 20%, you have to pay no office costs, and you can hire nationally or globally. And you may find wage bills are down a third as well. So basically that's become a cost play. Hybrid, where you're coming in, say 3 days a week, it looks like it has no negative effects on productivity and innovation. In fact, it may be slightly positive. You may be kind of puzzled, why could it be positive? The reason is you get 2 days a week that folks are at home. They save on commuting, which gives them a bit more time, they're a bit less tired. And home is actually quieter. And a lot of the evidence from psychology and creativity and innovation is a combination of like meetings and, post-it notes and chatting in person, but also deep reflection away. I mean, no one's creative from just like big shouty meetings. So it looks like hybrid actually slightly improves innovation and creativity. But hybrid here is defined as like the Apple plan. Everybody comes in Tuesday to Thursday, everyone's at home Monday, Friday.
You mentioned savings there, lots of costs being saved, using less space, better space. Our friend Draw, a glass can be half full and remain valuable, an office building can't. We talked about banks earlier. Obviously, it looks like from reading papers over the last few days, lots of corporate real estate exposure by many banks as well. And these corporate real estates, selling tools like Cadence pre-pandemic, offices weren't full of the best of times either. You walk around different offices here, they're 30-40% full on day-to-days normally. So one can only imagine what this is like post. Kevin, we're seeing a ton of our customers here at Cadence getting to the end of their leases and dramatically changing the way they think about their use of real estate. One of our customers has reduced their real estate by 68%. So their second largest cost has dropped by 68%. And they, at the same time, by using Cadence, they've increased the number of people regularly going in by 25%. So they're this nice kind of optimization play. How are you seeing is this a moment of downsizing? Is this a moment of flexible kind of leasing? Is this a flight to quality? What are you seeing on your side with regards to space utilization?
I guess what we're hearing from talking to companies and some of the real estate players is less space, better space generally. So, space that's better configured for hybrid hybrid arrangements. A lot of people abandoning dedicated office space, desks for individuals, and shifting to team-based space where you're effectively sharing space with other people, and they're reducing the ratio of desks to the number of staff. So I think in general, we're seeing the commercial footprint of companies decreasing significantly. Although in some cases, we're seeing them kind of upgrading the space, more modern buildings, and definitely reconfiguring the space.
Nick, have you seen anyone buy more space recently?
No, really, I completely align with Kevin. To explain what's going on, why don't I just give you numbers, because it's useful to think about it. In offices, in America, we now have about 10% of people that are fully remote, and that's true across much of Europe. those folks all used to work in offices. They're like IT support, payroll, HR benefits. So those people are just gone. So immediately, most companies have just got rid of 10% of desks, Reg in accounts or Sandra in payroll, they've just disappeared, and they're working in Mississippi or in Mexico. They're just not in American or Spanish or British offices. So that's one big saving of space that is permanent, that is there forever. The other thing that's become trickier is hybrid. So back to what Cadence does best, but you have hybrid that's kind of harder. Take the Apple plan. People are coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They're working at home Monday to Friday. It's hard to save a lot of space. The space savings we're seeing lines up with exactly what Kevin is talking about, which is when they're in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they're not really quietly working at their desks. They're in meetings, presentations, lunches, because it's 3 very social days. And it turns out with some careful planning, that can be a bit higher density. So you're getting into cubes and stuff. There's some, because somebody between meetings, but so most of the space seems to be from coming in, saving people going fully remote. On Cadence, the interesting thing is there are other firms doing this staggered hybrid. So some are having like team A on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, team B on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, like Stanford is doing that. And then you can potentially save quite a bit of space if you're organized about it and, you essentially run it, because then you're not overlapping.
Yeah. The challenge is if you force everyone on certain days, you have to have a desk for absolutely everybody. And so, Jonathan, your question here that we'll answer live now. What we're seeing specifically, your question being adjusting space usage in terms of design and layout. One of the things that we're seeing customers and companies all over the world rush to is creating neighborhoods or zones or areas that are particular for, it might be particularly for a team, it might be marketing mecca or whatever it might be for a particular team, product palace, or it might be actually high value, talking to what Kevin just mentioned, but actually inside of the space, higher value spaces inside the space as well. So this is the floor with the better harbor view, for example, or this is the floor with more breakout spaces rather than just desks or what have you. And so one of the interesting things I've seen recently is a way in which is a great company where they've got about 10 floors. They know ahead of time how many floors they're going to need because the amount of people that are booked for the next day. The way they've done it is they've got the reception and welcome area, obviously, on the ground floor and the first floor. Then they have the coffee area on the second floor. And then every layer above that kind of flexes and opens depending upon whether they have capacity for that or not. And the idea being that every floor feels like there's a buzz. So you're not got 8 other floors in which I thought was a really, really interesting use of space. They call them twats in the UK, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, those people that come in Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And some of the Cadence customers, they can't now cope with that capacity kind of increase or lack of capacity rather on those days. They see a peak, a mountain in the middle of the week. So what they're doing with our neighborhooding tool is they're actually putting people and saying, hey, you can have this particular floor on Monday and Friday. So the product team, hey, you can have these spaces, or you might have higher quality spaces, better breakout spaces, offsite, on-site on those days. You kind of mix who has access to book on those spaces. So yeah, vast amount of companies, as Kevin mentioned, going to 2-to-1 or sometimes 3-to-1 people to desk ratios, and then trying to even out the capacity across the course of the week. So there's not these overexposures.
Dan, just to add one thing to what you said, I've talked to some commercial real estate services companies, and they said that there is, in addition to what you said about that arrangement with shutting off some floors that aren't being used, you can actually save some money on custodial and other services, basically, because you're not cleaning the floors that are not being used in a given day. You can run your custodial operation a bit more efficiently. Security, there's some other kind of support services that can be run a little more lightly with some cost savings.
Well, and it trickles all the way through. I mean, Cadence is fortunate enough to contribute to 2 of our customers, 2 public companies, their ESG reports for this year around how they've been using their spaces, the emissions from their buildings, the combined saving and commute, and any associated emissions there. So yeah, using your space, Jonathan, in a way in which is scalable, controllable, and agile. We're all trying to make atoms as agile as bits, right? I think that's kind of what we're all trying to figure out. Super interesting. Now, kind of flicking back into high performing teams, we kind of touched on this a moment ago with some of the Apple news, what we've been seeing on the news around 4-day work weeks. It's very interesting. You know, some people are saying, hey, is this recession that we may or may not be in? Who knows? The definition may or may not have changed. That's a whole other topic. But it would have been really interesting to have this grand hybrid remote experiment in like a normal time, if you know what I mean. Like it would have been really interesting to have it in kind of normal sailing seas, if that makes sense. But it just turns out we're having this grand experiment in a, you know, post-global pandemic and then financial turmoil, uneven seas post. Would this, Nick, have been any different experience if we didn't have those headwinds or perhaps the volatility of the last couple of years? Forgetting, let's just say let's just imagine that it would happen anyway, that we all were going to have this experiment. Would it be different in less volatile seas?
Yeah, so I think stepping back, there's kind of an amazing thing about the pandemic, which is the technology we're using now to work hybrid or even remotely, like particularly Zoom in the cloud. Those are two big things, or Teams, you know, video calls based in the cloud. They've been around since about 2013, 2014. So they weren't around 20 years ago, but, you know, Zoom was founded in 2012, Teams. So 10 years ago, just about, these things around. No one adopted this in 2017, 2018. So why not? I think it looks like it was probably a collective mistake. The pandemic forced us to fully remote. Most companies were coming out of that around the time that the labor markets came really tight. So this kind of extended the pandemic remoteness, because in 2021, you wanted to, social distancing was calming down, but if you wanted to hire, you had to let people work from home a bit because it was so hard to hire anyone. Now in 23, if we enter into recession, we basically had 3 years of this. And honestly, it looks like it's stuck. I mean, I think hybrid is very much here to stay. Why? Because it makes firms more money. You know, it's like when I talk to companies, it's not a social movement. It's about being more profitable. And to put the biggest, most important numbers, if you ask employees how they value being able to work from home 2-3 days a week, they say it's about the same as an 8% pay increase. And if I also told you the number earlier that it doesn't reduce productivity, if you tell a firm you can do something that your employees value at about 8% of pay, and it probably slightly makes you more productive, saves you a bit of space, it basically has no downsides. Why wouldn't you? And that's the view. So if you look at Jamie Dimon up here, folks like this, or, you know, David Solomon, who I spoke to actually, Elon Musk, are generally arguing against fully remote. And that does have some major downsides. It also has some massive cost savings. Hybrid has no real downsides if it's well organized and has some quite substantial savings. You know, reduces turnover, makes it easier to hire people, keeps salaries a bit under control. So because of that, it's sticking. I just, you know, in 3 to 5 years time, actually, I think it will be more than it is now because the technology will get better. And Cadence is a case in point. The software is getting better, you know, video software, hardware is all getting better. So 3 years from now, I think we'll actually be higher levels of hybrid than we are now.
Kevin, any negative impacts you're seeing, some unexpected kind of fallouts from a hybrid policy being forced upon people? People saying, actually, I'm not going to move back from my ranch I've just purchased in Montana or whatever it might be. What unexpected? Obviously, you know, Apple lost their head of AI to Google over, the rumors are, over their hybrid policy. Any negative impacts on company culture is one of the questions we had.
I would say, and I just actually add on to what Nick said, which is that I think hybrid is sticking, and also the demographics support it. So the U.S. has very little skilled immigration at this point. The birth rate has actually been relatively low, and so over time there are actually significant pressures on the labor market at a macro level, you know, that will continue to support the workers, you know, the sort of the way the pendulum is spun towards workers' power. In terms of negatives, I think that there are a few things. One is that managers have actually not been really well equipped in a lot of cases to deal with this, and I think that there's just a real need to train managers to make the sort of changes that we've been talking about. Like, how do you manage for output rather than hours? How do you deal with the increasing sort of spectrum of issues that workers expect companies to be supporting them on. A lot of that training and support hasn't been done or hasn't happened effectively. And when you look at the instances of burnout across different populations, it's the middle managers who report the highest rates of burnout. And so I think one of the consequences of just this new world of work generally is that there's a lot of strain on managers who aren't being given the right tools and support. The other thing I would say is that I think that people are choosing, increasingly people can and will choose where they work for a group of knowledge workers who have different work options, and work configuration is going to be one of the things that they'll choose based on. So you could go work for a finance firm that where the expectation is you're in the office 5 days a week, or you could work for somewhere that allows you to continue living in your remote ranch, and you will choose one of those jobs potentially based on that criteria, which was not a very common thing, as Nick knows. That was more of a fringe.
It's a great point. I think that's one of the reasons you saw the Great Resignation, by the way, is that, you choose a job on, let's say, 2 criteria, and suddenly there's now a third one called whether you come in between 0 to 5 days a week, and that's random. And some people really like 5 and some really want 0, and they're stuck in a job that doesn't match it. And so there's an enormous churn as people churned. Some people really want to be fully remote and some really want to be in person. And that churn is dying down. But, it's amazing when you talk to recruiters, it's it used to be like pension, healthcare were the 2 benefits, then the role and the pay. And now there's a third one, which is your work from home policy. It's part of the key recruitment policy.
Yeah, you're certainly signing up to join the company's way of life now, not just for the salary and benefits. It's interesting. I mean, Kevin, talking there, we've blended so many things into this over the last few minutes, right? You've got space booking, consequences, on a macro level for what that means for the banking sector and any mortgages, assets held there, all the way through to performance of people and talent. I'd be interested to know from folks on the call here, the participants, we've got a bunch of facilities managers on this call. We've got a bunch of HR leaders on this call. We've got a bunch of C-suite people on this call. Hybrid really is touching every element of the business. I mean, the hybrid policy is essentially the operating system or the cadence of a company now. But we often find that it's, there's only one department that's looking at it, in terms of, when a customer comes to Cadence and says, and this is the HR team or the facilities team or the IT team or the workplace team, very rarely are there all the groups represented that appreciate that this is about performance and of both people, culture, space. When you're having conversations, I'll open this up to both of you, Nick and Kevin. Is there a particular job title persona that you're finding is more interested in different sections, or is the facilities manager above it? Is the head of HR above it? I'd love to hear the main personas that are engaging and are passionate about multiple of these topics.
I could, one thing I could share, which is maybe not exactly the answer to your question, but one of the things that we're finding is that people who are chief human resources officers or their leadership teams are being called on to contribute to the strategic business issues or conversation around strategic business issues in a way that has not traditionally been true. They haven't traditionally been in board meetings as much. They haven't traditionally stood side by side with CFOs. They haven't traditionally had the same stature in the conversations about business strategy and ultimately. And I think, among the things we're trying to do is actually equip them to make this shift, because a lot of the folks in those positions have been in basically back office compliance oriented careers in human resources. And just Dan, the reason I think it is like what you're saying is that the people management and the people dimensions of organizations, people are your biggest value multiplier in your organization for a lot of companies. And that organizations need people leaders to be operating across a set of issues and dimensions, including the ones you just named before, that they haven't traditionally been as focused on. And if they don't step in and do that, someone needs to. Someone else needs to.
Nick, are you seeing a particular persona or a blend with companies you're speaking with that are taking ownership of this?
Yeah, so first, just to reiterate what Kevin said, CHRs, HR leaders have got much more oomph in companies. They have moved up the importance scale. And I think correctly, I've been giving this message actually for a bit, that both deciding the work from home policies, but also managing it becomes much more critical, because it's harder to manage people when they're at the office. So you need performance evaluation tools. In terms of who is making decisions, it's interesting. My own personal journey is from 2020 to now. Is in the first year of the pandemic, I spoke to a lot of CEOs. I don't normally hang out with CEOs as a professor in Stanford. It's astounding. Like we're on Zoom. I spoke to Eric Yuan. I actually saw him a couple of weeks ago and spent some time with him. Satya Nadella from Teams. Just so many of these CEO types. David Solomon from Goldman Sachs, because it was such an unknown, weird thing. Everyone's like, "What on earth's going on?" I would say in the last 18 months, so going probably back to mid 2020, late 21, it's much more been the territory of CHRs. So what's happened is CEOs have kind of said, okay, things are stabilizing, it's here to stay. We're not entirely sure why, but CHRs, you need to figure out our policy and relate also to real estate folks. So those are the groups I'm talking to, much more real estate. Interesting, including outsider companies. So a lot of firms like CBRE, Tishman Speyer, JLL, office folks. Some city councils, as up in SF, Palo Alto, some transit folks, they've been really hit by this. But yeah, a lot within firms, it's increasingly CHR folks. And as Kevin said, I think they need to be in the room for the big decisions. I mean, one thing to tell you this, take this as a big picture, long run strategy.
Yeah, please.
Airbnb went to fully remote. Apple is requiring people to come in 3 days a week, Tuesday to Thursday. We know from our data that younger employees in their 20s would much rather come in typically 2-3 days a week. My students in Stanford, almost none of them want to be fully remote. They want to learn, they want to socialize, they don't have the apartments to support it. So what it's going to mean is for Airbnb, they're going to struggle to hire folks in their 20s. They're now looking at hiring folks in their 30s and 40s, whereas Apple is going to scoop up younger employees. That's neither right or wrong, but it's a pretty huge strategic decision about changing your entire workforce, your product placement, your aim, that's now related to hybrid. So as Kevin said, I think CHRs need to be in the room for big decisions now that touches on any of this, along with real estate folks, because the potential office savings are enormous.
Question here from Greg Walters. Do you think hybrid is transitory on the way to total remote? Speaking of managers, remote work, brackets, COVID illustrated the redundancy and irrelevancy of managerial layers. We've seen Zuckerberg in the last 2 or 3 weeks talk about, getting rid of different layers, being much leaner, seeing increased productivity from removing some of these managerial layers. Are we all going to end up with Zoom equipment that's sending holographs to our desks so we can see people? Are we all going to go fully remote? Nick, we'll start with you, and then I'd love to, Kevin, get your on the technology side, and then Kevin would love to touch on you with the irrelevancy of managers in these different layers.
So Greg, it depends on your time scale. Within the next 10 years, in the US, no. So in the US, as we've seen, actually, it's moving towards having folks in the office 2-3 days a week. And in fact, it's what the average employee actually wants. They want to come in 2-3 days a week. 10-20 years from now, the technology supporting this is changing a lot. There's been an explosion in startups, Cadence and others, that are focusing on making the work from home experience better, hardware, software. So 10-15 years, I was talking to a company the other day that's literally designing things for holograms. They use really expensive cameras to take 3-dimensional photos of people and then use that to beam them up. So look, in 10 years' time, that might be true. The other distinction to make is US versus, say, the Philippines. So in America, it's hard to support fully remote work often because you're now competing with folks that can do that abroad. I was talking to a group from Thailand, and from Thailand, they're seeing great growth because they're basically doing payroll and call center support for firms in Europe and North America. So in the US, if you want to push your career, I'd probably aim for hybrid because that's a safe job that's not going to be offshored or replaced by AI. 10-15 years time, you may be fully remote in the same role because the technology is so much better. But in the short run, no, I don't think we're going fully remote, not in the US at least.
Yeah,
or Europe.
one of my closest friends, his EA is now in the Philippines, and he's super happy with how he's working with her from the West Coast here. What about what Zuck has done, Kevin, and these different layers of managerial class? Maybe that's just a meta thing that was going on with those guys. But what about managers needing special skills now to lead in this environment?
Yeah, I think that, I would put Meta aside, because Meta and the other FANG companies just hired so many people during the last few years, hundreds of thousands of people. And even the layoffs that they're doing now are a small fraction of the extent to which their staff swelled. I would say, all of and Nick may have thoughts on this as well, but I would say that all of the research that I've seen supports within reason the direct impact and influence of your manager on your own performance and your retention at a company. And so I think that research suggests to me that middle managers, there's a lot of people who've never been taught to manage, they're not supported. It's an add-on management role where they're actually continuing to do sales because they're good at sales and they're told to manage some people. So it's not structured in a way that they're really able to support people. But the research that I've seen suggests that managers are as important as ever. And I would suggest there's a book that a former colleague of mine at the Wall Street Journal wrote, Sam Walker. It's called The Captain Class. He looked at professional sports dynasties. He studied the teams that won multiple seasons over the last 100-something years and across professional sports. And the thing that he found that correlated with these dynasties was that they had excellent captains. It wasn't their budget. It wasn't their manager. Is actually the captain, the player who led them on the field.
Yeah.
And for me, that is the metaphor for managing people these days, that you're giving feedback in the moment. You're not waiting for the performance review. You're someone who your colleagues trust to lead you through a come from behind situation.
Yeah.
I guess I would push back against the idea that managers are irrelevant and suggest the sort of captain model is an interesting way to think about it.
On the technology side of this question, Greg, as well, I'm incredibly fascinated to continue to play around with ChatGPT, and I know everyone's talking about it. But I'm imagining a world where it's learning my tone of voice all the time, and it's learning my preferences, and it's learning how I operate. And I'm able to turn that on out of hours to some extent. Maybe I don't know what time period that is over, and we were kind of talking about the banking crisis at the start of this call. And, if we weren't awake during that time period, we may not have been able to react the way we did and shore up some part of our banking infrastructure. And so there is this, I think, fear amongst some CEOs of like, can I actually go away? Can I be off work? Can I not be on Twitter and having, the right people pinging me stuff at all hours, because something may happen that I may not be able to execute on? And so I think that kind of, and obviously there's a ton of consequences here, but the ever-presentness that I think an AI avatar will allow you to have over time is an incredibly interesting proposition for getting more out of yourself and helping employees layer up. Our engineers are experimenting with lots of AI tools to make code and development faster and quality assurance faster. We're writing content with ChatGPT's help and assistance. So I think that's a very interesting trend to be following around. One question here we have, Nick, as well, around, you talked about whether we talked about Apple, 9 people going in, perhaps it was just an example, it wasn't them it's being cited, but 9 people going in, 1 person being remote from the team. Are there any scenarios, a question here from Andrew Lorenz, are there any scenarios that you've seen help play out really well on this? Setups for Zoom, setups for Teams, equipment? How have you, or does everyone just have to log on to Zoom? I know that was a big thing during the pandemic, that we wanted everyone to feel a part of it. So even if you're in person, you had to go on. Has that changed now? There isn't the safety requirements, let's say, for going in or staying at home. Has any of that changed? Has everyone gets a Zoom tile kind of faded away as as there's not an excuse not to go in?
Great question. I mean, one, I guess, three quick thoughts. So one is, we just did some research on Zoom cameras on or off. Turns out everyone feels they're dramatically more engaged with their cameras on, and that other people in the meeting are more engaged when their cameras are on too. So it's symmetric. So it looks like, look, having your cameras on, it's no surprise, means you're paying attention. If your camera's off and you're muted, you're probably, to be honest, doing something else. So I think for big meetings, I get it. If there's 30 people, you know, you maybe have it off and you're, you know, doing your yoga or exercise or whatever. But look, if you're in meetings of kind of 6 or less people, I would norm to have cameras on. Second thing is, there is some software that is starting to come out that's more kind of always on, always off. So there's a company called Roam that has kind of a virtual office. And rather than Zoom, you pop in and out, you're kind of always there. Maybe it's audio and visual, but I want to go speak to Kevin. One of the problems with, you know, Zoom is that you just have to have like a 15 or 30 minute meeting. Well, I may want to speak to Kevin and say, hey, by the way, where is this? What are these numbers? And it's 3 minutes. So a place like Roam, they have him sat in his office. I pop in, I just speak, it comes out of his speaker and then disappears. And look, if he's, you know, in the bathroom, then he puts, you know, out the office. But that's more trying to, for, you know, companies that are hybrid or remote, try to replicate what's going on in person.
We use the huddle function in Slack, like for
Yeah.
that a little bit, Nick.
Yeah, we use that.
And it works pretty well.
Yeah, we use that a ton too. It's super interesting. Thank you, folks. Let's imagine we're a quarter out. Bring this to a close in just a second. We're a quarter out. What's going to happen over this quarter? I know, Nick, we were pontificating in the spring of 2022. We were saying, hey, cadence, our big theme for product, was coming out of 21. Companies were going to be moving from chaos to order. And our bet in 2022 that people were going to move from order to orchestration, that they were going to go and try and figure out, right, who's going to be in when are the right times to be in, what other projects are people working on. So let's try and recommend to update your cadence to be overlapping at those times. That's absolutely happening. We've definitely seen, particularly interestingly in Australia and the US over this quarter at Cadence, we've seen companies reduce their real estate quite significantly. And that may just be to do with lease times and things like that and contracts. But we're a quarter out. What's going to happen this quarter that hasn't yet happened, Kevin?
I think there are two things that come to mind. The first thing is, I think that there are a lot of companies who I've spoken with who have a hybrid work plan officially that's not observed, and there haven't been a lot of consequences for that. And it just doesn't seem like that can continue indefinitely, that they're gonna, you know, like Apple has, start cracking down in some kind of surveillance sort of way, or in some other way to start impacting people's performance reviews, things like that. I don't see that. I see the increasing impatience of heads of organizations with the current status. So I would say that. The other thing is that I think that these questions that Nick is studying, I think, are super relevant and have real urgency. The question about performance and innovation / creativity in a hybrid setup. And I think there's a lot of hunger for both the kind of more granular understanding of what the consequences are and best practices for how to facilitate performance and innovation in a more flexible work structure. And I'm excited for that, to kind of better understand and see the practices that people are experimenting with now and getting some good conviction around.
Yeah, on that point, a customer of ours here in the Valley, crypto company, they've got half as many desks as they have people. They said since coming back in regularly, they're making quicker decisions and their product team is moving faster since coming back in regularly. That's the co-founder talking there. Nick, last few seconds, we're talking.
Totally aligned with Kevin. Totally aligned with Kevin's. I was going to say Kevin's first point, enforcement. I think the big thing I see is firms are just enforcing plans that are on paper. So it will back to 2019. Look, in 2019, if you said, I want to watch the World Cup, or it's cold outside, I'm not coming to the office, it'd be like, are you joking? Yeah, that's just not okay. In 2021, it was. In 2023, it's not going to be okay again.
Is that economics? Is that driven by the economy in particular, or is that just, hey,
A little bit. I think it's driven by the awareness. Look, take Apple, as we've discussed them before. If you're supposed to be in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there's an enormous team benefit from everyone coming in. So, you know, just one rogue person doesn't come in, it costs everyone else. In 2021, there's a lot of other motivations around social distancing or desperate employees. That's not true now. So it's not like this is brutal enforcement. We're a lot better than we were in 2019. You get to work from home on Monday, Friday. It's just, you know, you don't get to work from home 5 days a week.
Yeah. My big thing. Oh, go ahead.
Just one thing that we haven't talked about, but it's that caregivers and workers of color generally value flexibility and take advantage of it. And it's been, you know, Nick has made this point that among the advantages of hybrid work is greater diversity and inclusion potentially. And I think that as that enforcement increases, I think that, you know, the kind of thing to watch out for a lot of companies is that they do it in a way that's compatible with retaining workers who are caregivers and workers of color for whom these are flexibility in different dimensions is wound up being pretty important.
My prediction for this quarter is that the autonomous self, people are going to understand that being a part of the team is actually being better than having complete autonomy yourself. Like maybe that's far too optimistic. Maybe that's never going to happen. But there's some really interesting kind of metaphysics scientists that are coming out with data about how actually everything comes about in relation to something else. So whether that is a glass of wine that came about in its relation to the grapes that were pressed in a particular way and the soil that they were in, and going back all the way to we're actually relational beings that are capable of being individuals rather than individual beings that are capable of being in community. And so it's my hope, and hopefully tools like Cadence, where you can optimize who you're going to be in with and when, and really feel a part of a team, and knowing that being part of the team is actually when we're at our best, rather than just having all the autonomy to ourselves. Cool. And that's what captains are there to do, to your great point, Kevin. Thanks for all the questions today. Nick's got his hand raised.
No, I've got to go. I'm sorry. This is I'm sorry. I'm like 2 minutes late for a meeting. Kevin, Dan, it was great to catch up. But
guys, thank you. This will be made widely available. Have a great Tuesday. Thanks, everybody. Kevin, Nick, thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Dan.